I am Dawn Marie Solis, and I am thrilled to be talking on behalf of INIS 2022 Neurodiversity Conference with Dr. Bill Wong. Dr. Wong is an occupational therapist who is also autistic and is doing a lot of wonderful work advocating for medical professionals who are also autistic and other neurodivergent identities to be seen and understood. And I can't wait to have this conversation. Dr. Wong, thank you so much for being with me today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's definitely a pleasure to share a little bit about my insights about being an autistic occupational therapist, but also shine the light of other autistic medical professionals, because I feel that in recent years, you know, people like Hayley Moss, like she is very celebrated as an autistic lawyer, what she does, or Carrie Margle, he is very celebrated and his work at Autism Speaks, so it's like these kind of figures. And it's almost like, well, I have similar kind of accomplishment in some sense, as Carrie Margle, but it seems like I always am on the anonymity among the autistic community is concerned. So I was like, and then when I talked to other folks from other disability groups, they were like, you accomplished a lot. How come you are not as visible in the autistic community as you should? You should do something about it. So that was what led me here today.
I'm really glad, and I hope this does help with your visibility. You're doing such good work advocating, and you're also helping with a research team, I think I understand, that's looking into autism and aging. Is that correct?
That's correct. And they're from Australia.
That's wonderful. Can you tell me a little bit about the work you do with them?
Sure, no problem. So actually, this is part of our cross-cultural research in partnership with Western Sydney University. So I'm partnering up with two researchers. Their names are Caroline Mills and Christy Coxon. They're both lecturers from Western Sydney University. And it's my privilege to actually partner up with them on the autistic aging research. So let me give you a backstory on how that came about too. I think that is also very interesting. So in 2014, I met Dr. Mills at an occupational therapy conference in Japan. And I remember that she actually passed by my poster presentation at that conference. And when she took a look at my poster, I said to her, like, oh, by the way, I'm also autistic. And she was like, well, this is so interesting. I was like, I have never really encountered somebody like that, at an OT conference of all places, and you're doing it at some of our bigger conferences since it's like the OT Olympics, so it's like at a conference that's like in a world stage, it's like you have the competence to present your work at such a place like this. I definitely want to be in touch with you. And then 5 years later, I visit Dr. Mills in her home country in Australia for her national conference in Australia. So we were just talking about research. So of course, at that time, I was like 7 years into my practice as an occupational therapist, and I just started into teaching. So I just talked to Dr. Mills and say, hey, you know what? I want to do some research with you. I have some really hard time finding partners because of the fact that maybe people don't really take me seriously, but I'm definitely interested in doing research. I definitely am interested to really advance my career further as an occupational therapist. So it's like, would you be willing to be my ally to help get me started off the ground in terms of getting research? So in 2020, that was when Dr. Mills and we reconnect. And we just happened to have an opportunity in the university I teach at Stanford University. And we just found out that like, oh, I'm going to be taking on a thesis group for our Masters of Occupational Therapy program. So I definitely need to find someone I definitely need some ideas in terms of research is concerned. So I said, hey, you know what? I got a lifeline in Dr. Mills. Like, why don't I reach up to her and say, hey, what kind of ideas that we can collaborate between Australia and the US? And then when Dr. Mills says like, hey, you know what? Aging and autism is a very hot area of research right now. It's a really emerging area of research. It's like, would you be interested in this? And I said, you know what? This sort of is in my ballpark because, like, hey, that's my clinical work setting right now. I don't see that many autistic adults. But that said, it's like, hey, I have been in this kind of environment. At that time, it was say 5 years, So definitely, it's like, even though I was not a resident in these kind of setting, but I was like, hey, I was in these settings like 8 hours a day, sometimes more if I do overtime. So therefore, it's like I was very immersed in these kind of settings, even though I come from a different lens. So I said, I'm interested. And then Dr. Mills says, like, hey, you know what? Let me introduce my colleague, Dr. Coxon. And that's how the three of us, we came together for our first project last year. And our first project last year with our master students were about the self-advocacy of healthcare practitioners working with autistic older adults. And then now
Wow.
our current project now is we're asking the same questions, except we're targeting occupational therapy and occupational therapy assistants in the US for now, because we have made some adjustments from the last time. And we just realized that it's like, hey, you know what? In the US, we're going to be the guinea pig of what's the project is going to come in Australia. So that's the reason why it's like this year our project is a little different because in Australia, OT assistants is not a thing. They're not licensed professionals like we do here in the US. So that's
Mm-hmm.
the reason why it's like we just like, you know what? We just do the project in the US as a pilot. And since we last talked, by the way, we also have a new development. So I also talked to another Australian researcher. Her name is Kitty Foley, and we are going to do another research about autistic adults as well. And she is from Sunshine Coast University in Australia. And our incoming project, because it's not started yet, our impending project is going to be on the lived experiences of the professional journeys of autistic occupational therapy and occupational therapy assistant students aside and also new grads. And by new grads, we talk about practitioners with 0 to 5 years of practice experience in OT.
That's so exciting. Oh my goodness. And my thoughts just went in about 90 different directions. I think though that I want to pull us back to part of your advocacy work, and then we'll, if we have time, we'll come back to the research you're doing. As an occupational therapist, you had to go through quite a bit of schooling. You had to achieve quite a bit, like you said, in the United States. That that's something you need to obtain a license for. You can't just wake up one morning and say, "Hey, I'm an occupational therapist," right? So, can you tell me a little bit about what it was like for you personally to go after this set of knowledge? Were there things that were difficult for you? Were there people who didn't think you could achieve it? Were there things that you found easier than maybe some of your fellow students? Just a little bit about your experience coming into your profession.
No problem, you got it. So I will also add some context as well. So
Okay.
actually, I found out my autism diagnosis in between my education as an occupational therapist.
Wow.
So yeah, so that's another context that I should add before I begin. So one thing I think I found difficult, I think, is the internships. So like medical doctors, they had to do their clinical rotations. So as an occupational therapist, I had to do mine. And I remember before finding out my diagnosis, I actually failed my first clinical rotation that actually matters to my licensure. So that was actually what led me to find out about my autism diagnosis. And then in terms of, so that's one thing I can say that's difficult for me at the start, right? And then because
Yeah.
of the timing of the diagnosis, so I found out my diagnosis 3 days before I began my second year of OT school. So that is very difficult because of the fact that it's like, well, I just found out my diagnosis and now I'm going to scramble to figure out like, hey, what are my accommodations I'm eligible for and what do I need? that's very hard to do it within a
Yeah,
span of a few weeks, right?
yeah,
That's
absolutely.
that's one I would say that's one struggle with. I think for me, because I struggle a lot in my early schooling before my I got my doctorate degree. So I think one of my strengths is that I am also a very resilient person. So I think the fact that it's like, you know what, is like I realized that, hey, you know what, I'm autistic. I found out this, even though I'm behind the eight ball, but I told myself, you know what, I'm gonna go down swinging. I think that this is one trait until like I have this professional success today. I think this is one of the traits that my classmates would know me for at that time because like, my classmates was like they would sweat sometimes I would post stuff on social media and it's like about the small stuff that they're going through. But then I was like, you know what? I went through worse and hey, you know what? I'm recovering. I'm trying to keep my dreams alive. That's a bigger struggle. So therefore it's like yeah, when my classmates they realized that I was like, wow, you are very resilient given the circumstances you have dealt. So I think the resiliency is one, and then another one I think is optimism. I think I'm more optimistic. I guess that comes with my personality, because you know what? I told myself I cannot look at things negatively in my life. Otherwise, it's like you know what? Things are gonna drown. And in a grad school environment, it's like survival is key. I need to have a dogged optimism to survive. I think that is another one. I think third one is like, you know what, I am very proactive. I think given that is like I realized that on top of the fact that I had to find out my accommodations on the fly, I also had to figure out my own care on the fly. I think it's like that really forced me to be more proactive to ask questions because I realized that if I don't ask these questions, I cannot have help myself.
That's incredible. It's a really inspiring story. I think I think it would be very difficult for the average person to continue trying if they'd done the practical part and hadn't succeeded the first time around, and that you were able to cheer yourself on and figure out how to get that done for yourself. That's really inspiring to me. Thank you for sharing that.
Well, but I
Um,
also have one more thing though. I also have one more
okay.
thing is like I also was very lucky to be in a system where like you know what I had the time to get the support I need before I jump back into the situation. I know with some autistic students that I came across later, it's like sometimes the turnaround time you're talking about maybe a few months, and then they got to
Yeah.
get back on the saddle again. So it's like in that situation, I also had the luxury of time versus like some students I've encountered later, I realized that they don't.
Yeah. Do you have any suggestions for young people who may want to go into some piece of the medical field, but maybe they're being discouraged? Unfortunately, there's a lot of prejudice about autism, a lot of misunderstanding, and young people who do have a diagnosis, they might have folks in their life that caution them away from pursuing anything in the medical field. What would you say to them?
Yeah, that's a good question actually. So I think one, I think is definitely finding mentorship as early as possible. I think especially given that my degree is a master's degree, and I'm getting my doctorate, it's like the coursework is gonna be vigorous. And then of course the rotation part, like depending on what the skills are, what the assets are, what the limitations are, it's like I think having a support system early is very huge. I think that's what's why like I know recently I talked to another student from the East Coast and she was just starting her she didn't even start her clinicals yet, but her program director was very generous in terms of recommending me to her. So we have been talking, I would say, at least every other week to sort of like prepare her to navigate the clinical rotations that she may face because there's a very different atmosphere than in the classroom. Because in the classroom, that's very standards. You can get like the standard set of accommodations. But in the clinical world, sometimes it's like some of these accommodations are you get in a classroom, they don't fly. So I think finding mentorship is very important in terms of how to navigate the day to days, but then also think about like what kind of accommodation that they can ask in such a situation. I think it's very important. And I think also is support system. I mean, for me, I guess my case is a little different than other autistic OT students and practitioners who came after me. For me, I came out at a time when there weren't as many autistic OT students and practitioners coming out as autistic. So therefore, my allies typically, because of that, had to be neurotypical allies, you
Mm-hmm.
know. So therefore, it's like I had to do a lot of window shopping in terms of who I want as my mentor and who I want as my allies or my peers to push me forward in my career. Now I think it's a little different ballgame. I mean, like, you know, it's like still, I mean, autistic is still a minority, but that said, I think over the last 12 months, I encountered 5 students from different universities who identify themselves as autistic, which is like, that's a pretty big number compared to a decade ago, for sure,
Yeah.
at least from my perspective. So I think it's like, yeah, so I also try to like find some avenues for these students to connect with one another so that it's like they know that hey, they are not alone in this journey, you know.
That's
I think that's
great.
like the camaraderie, right? The camaraderie piece, right?
Absolutely. Knowing that you have some kind of community, even if you're very far apart from each other, can make a huge difference. Are there any that you know of, or have you started any more formal organizations where uh, occupational therapy students who are autistic can find each other and be part of
Technically I
a
did not start one. Technically I
mm,
did not start one, but I know in our national association, so there is a community practice group on autism. So a year and a half ago, I was the only autistic voice, but somehow, some way, the word just spread. So I think in late 2020, another autistic student joined the group, and then she found out that I'm autistic. Like, whoa, this is so cool! Like, I didn't expect to find another autistic practitioner in the group, and then now I've been using that as an avenue to whoever come my way and say, hey, I just recommend this group. If you can make it, join that group. We meet once a month. I mean, yes, you know, there are quite a bit of neurotypicals involved as well. But at least it's like, hey, you know what? At least to see another autistic face, another autistic peers sharing similar stages of the journey, or someone like me who's further ahead than them is like, I think that'll be very helpful. Rather than they realize like, oh, I'm all alone in this. And then like I showed them, it's like, no, this is not the case, you know? It's like there are some people like you. You just have to find them.
oh my gosh, that's so good. I think had I understood younger, because I didn't understand my identity until I was 50 as a neurodiverse person. I knew that I was dyslexic, but I didn't know I was autistic and ADHD. And I think for somebody of my age, it would have felt very difficult to express my identity publicly. Um, I'm someone who is very willing to be whoever I am, so I think I might have had that courage. Do you feel like today it still takes some courage to be publicly out as an autistic person in a professional role?
I actually agree with your sentiment. I actually agree with your sentiment because like when I first came out, I feel like when I do presentations about autism in my professional realm, it's almost like people are like, whoa, this is a very refreshing perspective. It's like, this is very different than most autism presentations that we have heard in the past because it comes from a first person who also understand our language, you know?
Yeah.
So it's like, it's very interesting, it's very unique. I think that, of course, like some of the environments are not very conducive for autistics. Like for example, like the national conference I typically go to every year before COVID, like a poster session, like the that can be like a lot of heavy traffic, a lot of sensory input. that can be challenging to present a poster, even though you just have to go over and over for like you have a 2 to 3 minute speech over and over, for in the span of 2 hours. It's like, or you have to do a workshop, for an hour and a half, 3 hours. Some people may find it anxiety provoking because, like, hey, you know what? It's like I don't want to look like an idiot out there, right? So like that kind of anxiety that can definitely come. Is like, do I really have expertise? I think that is, and then like another thing that I really found out over the years is that aside from doing all these presentations, I also so try to find my way into publications in my own field. I realized that it's also trying to get a space in that realm is very difficult sometimes because like it's almost like who you know. It really makes a huge difference. So in my case, it's like I actually recently advocated for a self-advocacy chapter in our pediatric textbook. And when I brought the idea, people were like, "Oh, this is something that we never had before." But now it's like you brought it up. I think it's really interesting that you really want to address this, you know? So it's almost like, and then it's like I'm a little different than most autistic OT practitioners and students because I'm more well connected. So therefore, it's like I know who to ask and when's the right time to sort of ask these kind of questions. But I feel that if other autistic OT students and practitioners trying to do the same, they may find it harder to do so because like they may not have as much connections in the field than I do. So I feel like that is something that's like there's still a lot of things that had to be advocated for. It's almost like you gotta knock on the right door, so to speak. I mean, not to just say it's like, hey, you know what, the other autistic OT students and practitioners can't in the long run, but it's just like, you know what, the road to get the first step sometimes is more difficult than realized. I guess that's what I'm trying to say.
Well, you had mentioned in your advice that getting a good mentor as early as possible was key to success. And, I think that sort of ties in. Many of us who are autistic or ADHD, we can have some social anxieties and we can find it difficult to introduce ourselves to people, to include ourselves in spaces that are unfamiliar or uncomfortable. But it does seem like finding our way to make those connections can do a lot for us in the long run, from what you're saying, right? It's in those situations where it's who you need to sort of build that foundation for yourself as you go through your education and start your career. Is that correct? Am I
Yeah,
understanding you?
that's pretty correct. Yeah, that's pretty correct because like it's like earlier we talked about the Australian researchers, right? It's like if I really don't make the trip to go to Australia to actually reconnect with those researchers, I don't think these kind of research opportunities would happen. So therefore, it's almost like a give and take. That's why sometimes I post on social media, and sometimes even I ask the first question that I would ask any autistic mentees I have. The first meeting, I just ask them is like, "Hey, what are your goals? Ultimately, be honest with me." And then I'll tell you it's like, "Hey, you know what? This is what you need to do." It's
That's
like
great.
after, yeah, and then it's say it's like, "Hey, after hearing that, would you think that is it still worth it?" Because like I know on social media people talk a lot about unmasking, you know,
Hmm.
but it's almost in my kind of situation as like, well, if I want to climb up the ladder, the cost is I cannot unmask myself.
Oh, part of the reason why I started putting in his 2022 neurodiversity conference together was so that we could join with people like you, and start creating space for us in society. What you just said breaks my heart. The idea that any of us feel like we can't just be ourselves because we'll get discounted, discredited, set aside, not listened to, even bullied and pushed out. Um, I've had personal experiences myself where people have really misunderstood my autism, and it makes it as soon as somebody misunderstands, it makes it impossible to communicate. And when you're in a medical situation, communication is key. Right? You can't do your job if you're not fully understanding what your client or your patient needs. And so when we run into medical professionals who don't understand what autism is, don't understand how someone might communicate, what their needs and accommodations might be, we lose our access to good medical care. And so I really value you and others like you who are willing to be out publicly as an autistic person in your field, because we need to know a couple of different things. One, if I lived near you and I needed occupational therapy, you'd be my choice because you would get me. You would know what I mean when I say I'm autistic. You would know what I mean when I say I have situational mutism. You would know what I mean when I say I have and visual processing challenges, right? You would know what I mean. And if you weren't totally sure what I meant, you'd know how to talk to me about it because you relate.
Oh yeah, for sure. And we just talk about communication, right? So even yesterday, actually, so we had a meeting with my students, talk about research. So it's like there were times it's like, you know what? It's like we trying to. It's like when we do a cross-cultural research. Oh my God! It's like you cannot imagine how much challenges we have sometimes when it comes to like try to get on the same page. I mean, like the good thing is that Dr. Mills, she really gets me, so she is really understanding. Is like, hey, you know what? It's like sometimes I interject because like, hey, you know what? It's like we need to get stuff done. Or the fact that it's like, hey, you know what? There are some stuff that's like maybe what she commented is not appropriate or is not applicable to the US is concerned. So it's like, you know what? There are times that like and then she also understands is like, hey, you know what? I'm supposed to be in charge of this in a sense. So it's like, you know what? It's like so therefore it's like the conversations. There were times that my students see is like, oh, sometimes I interrupt her, but it's like, hey, you know what? It's like, you know what? Sometimes it's like it's just my attempt. It's like, hey, you know what? We don't want to get into a rabbit hole here, you know. Or
Yeah.
sometimes it's like, and then of course we also both understand research, so it's like we also like, hey, you know what? We're on the same page to sort of like we try to get each other's back at the end of the day. So therefore it's like, yeah. So it's like, you know what? So I think that she also got used to it. It's like, and then I also got used to her ways as well. So it's like, you know what? If she interrupts me because like I'm not making sense, so like, okay, you know what? You have permission because like I do that with you. I do that with you. So it's like it's okay. So yeah. So
Yeah.
it's like so I think that research, I think that's another piece that is like communication when it comes to cross-cultural context. It's so key to understand one another. I mean, like one example we talk about, like, oh my God, it's like when we talk about the definition of a student in our research, I couldn't believe that it took 15 to 30 minutes just to figure over what's the definition of a student that is translatable for both cultures.
Yeah, you wouldn't think that that was a difficult thing to define, but especially today, we need to make sure we're being both accurate and inclusive in our definitions of things. So I'm grateful you all took the time. That's really good.
Yeah, but
Um,
I think of course I talk about challenges, right? You talk about communication. I was like, well, that's a communication example for you.
that's great. Dr. Wong, in terms of finding work as an occupational therapist and an autistic person, what did you find any impediments to getting work that you think were connected to you being autistic, or did that just never come into play for you?
So there are, of course, I think I think regardless I'm neurotypical or not, I think our first year is always the most difficult because it's the transition of expectations. So I
Sure.
think that I think that is but of course, talk about transitions, it's like that's a pretty common struggle for autistic students. to the workforce. That's a pretty common. I guess it's like in some sense, in some cases, that could get magnified, but not always. I guess that's one way to say it, you know. I think one thing that I think that came into play sometimes, I would say that probably came into play more now with my career as an educator. I realized that it's like there are times that it's like, you know what, my executive function is going haywire. So sometimes I might just ramble on, and then I try to buy myself time to write the ship. So I think my thesis group students, they have gotten used to my executive function dysfunction sometimes when it comes to things. There are times that it happens, you know. But I think they also know that it's like, hey, you know what? If I'm right, I am on the ball, you know. So I can guide them to the right thing. I can guide them to do the right thing if I don't have those episodes. I think that's one. I think one challenge I would say for medical professionals who are autistic, sometimes they may have some challenge. Speaking of transitions, there's another kind of transition that is like, you know, in kids, right? Sometimes like they may have transition difficulties from one period to another period, something like that, right? Or sometimes they may struggle with things changing without much notice. Unfortunately, in the medical environment, it's like, well, there are times that it's like, you know what, you are not gonna get a routine day every day. Every day is not the same because the fact that so in my setting in particular, right? So one, it could be that it's like, hey, my schedule of patients that I have to see are different every day, you know. So there is no set schedule. And then another thing is like, hey, you know what? In the elderly setting, sometimes it's like you may catch somebody who just returned from dialysis treatments. So obviously their abilities to function is very different before they go into dialysis. Is very different, right? And sometimes they also have other medical conditions. So sometimes they have a good day, they would like to work with you, but then the same patient the next day they have a bad day, and it's like, you know what? I don't want you to come. Screw you. Get out here, right? So it's like
Yeah.
that kind of deal, you know. So you don't. So I think is that, and then yeah. So I think that little things change with little notice. I think that is something that autistic folks getting into the medical field they may have to get used to, particularly in my field. I think you have to get used to. And then another thing, because I'm an occupational therapist, so in my setting or any other setting, sometimes they may have to be the first initial encounter or the initial point of contact to start these cases in the system. So, you know, it's like if you have trouble approaching people and then you don't really have any not too much information about a person, but it's like in these instances, because you have to do your job, it's like, well, you know what? It's like I wouldn't meet somebody whom I don't know a thing aside from the medical conditions. You know? It's like
Yeah.
that's difficult. You can imagine how difficult it is, right? Yeah, so it's like you have
Yeah.
no picture of anything. It's not like online dating. You see a picture of that person. I was like, or it's like that kind of person, you know. It's like, and then sometimes like you read stuff on the medical chart, but then you may see something different than what you expect on the medical chart. So for me, my strategy have been like, if I see somebody I don't know, I tell myself it's like I'm gonna do what like Campbell Grandin does, is like try to think in pictures of what I anticipate that patient might be like, but then I also have to be like willing to toss that aside if it is something different than I anticipated. It's
Yeah.
almost
So
like added imply, right?
yeah, it sounds like to be a medical professional, you have to find a way to access your flexibility. Um,
Oh yeah, and then problem solving is also very important too, because like I mean, in a clinical environment, you know, you have your tools, you know, and stuff, but sometimes it's like, hey, you know, if you go to like a home health situation, you're working in a patient's home, then you have to adjust to their environment. You know, sometimes you have to come up with problem solving. You cannot be just going to an appointment and then you realize like, oh, you know what? They don't have this equipment. They don't have that equipment. How do I work with this patient? It's like you have to come up with solutions on the fly. Otherwise, it's like you don't want the patient or the caregiver to say, "Hey, you know what? This person's not competent. How come it's like we don't have this, we don't have that, but that person is really not willing to work with us because of that?"
Yeah. Have you ever felt added stress to perform well so that people uh, view you as an autistic person well?
Good question. So I think one, of course, to keep my job, I think there's certain level of expectations, in a
Hmm.
clinical space. I think it's like being competent to treat patients. I think that is one. And then in the classroom, obviously, and then like I definitely don't want to have moments where I have blanks, right? I look blank out there in the classroom. Even if it's a Zoom environment, like it looks pretty bad because like, the students think like, what is this guy doing here? How come this guy is our teacher? Like I mean the thing
Yeah.
is like I teach master students, so I definitely cannot look like an idiot out there right now.
Oh, yeah. One of the things I had to battle with for myself, I've been coaching for it'll be 28 years in August, and um, when I understood my identity, my natural self is to just be very vocal.
Hmm.
Uh, but I noticed quickly that people in my life changed toward me when I explained that I'm autistic and ADHD, in a variety of ways, but a number of people started doubting my abilities. And that was really hard for me to cope with. Um, I don't enjoy being seen as less than who I am. And there's still this stigma around being autistic that can come through very obviously, even aggressively. And I think especially
Oh
for
yeah,
us
I definitely hear you.
when we're in professional environments, um, it can feel really, really difficult to be judged the same way because there may already be a prejudice that we have some kind of diminished capacity. Um,
Oh yeah, or sometimes it's like in my situation, sometimes it's like in a leadership environment, so I'm pretty involved in my professional level. So therefore, it's like if I make a blunder like this, sometimes it's like I get looked at under a microscope, and that is not a
mm,
very comfortable feeling. I mean, like yeah, it's like for me, it's like well, it's almost like I know on social media talk about like well, you're getting treated like anti-standard neurotypical standards in terms of socially, but then it's like in that kind of environment, especially like a medical environment, it's like well, it's like what can we do? It's like at the end of the day, it's a service profession. We have to provide customer service. So what can we do?
yeah, I'm hoping that with time and with more people like you out there talking about the fact that, uh, autistic people exist everywhere, right? We are everywhere, whether we know we're autistic or whether we're being vocal about our autism, we really are everywhere. Um, but it's taking a very long time for society to not just make space for us. I've used the analogy of a holiday table, right? Like a dinner table, where you might make plans so that people who eat with their left hands aren't bumping elbows with people who eat with their right hands, right? That's making space. Truly including a person is providing an environment where they don't feel like they've been set to the side, right? Sure, you're still at the table, but you're like over there, right? How can we arrange this table so that we're not still maintaining some kind of intellectual or physical exclusion, right? The pretense or the facade of inclusion. What can we be doing uh, so that there is a legitimate equity in environments? And I think one of the things that you said earlier about your relationship with your research partners in Australia was that you got used to each other and you gave each other space. It's not, I'm an autistic person, therefore you must get used to me. It's, we are people, and we need to get used to each other, and we need to make sure that we both have equal voice. We both have a sense of capacity and control in our environments, without either one of us feeling diminished. And
Good
that's
question. So I
legitimate.
will also add to one thing. I'll
Thank
also
you.
add one thing too. So I know in recent years in healthcare fields, they're looking at holistic admissions. So they're trying to increase diversity in healthcare in general. So I think that one of the things that can be helpful, I guess, is like the education part. That can be like a shelter kind of environment. I think it's like, I mean, like in the education realm, it's like, you know what, you can try to recruit faculty who have cultural humility and very skills, like good skills in terms of like how to work with different types of students. I think that is a good start. But in the medical field, the thing is that our clinical rotations, they are the luck of the draw sometimes. You know, sometimes like the students can get good placements, sometimes the students can get bad placements. So that's the thing. I think that's another thing. Another thing I think is important is to teach students about self-advocacy skills, especially autistics who, since they talk about autism in general in this conversation. So like we have to teach our autistic students on self-advocacy skills and also making them aware of signs that like, hey, you know what? They're being discriminated upon or targeted upon or find ways to protect themselves, especially since they will be in these environments regularly without the eyes from their program, you know? I mean, like the program cannot be, like the faculty cannot be with them at the sites 24/7 in a sense, right?
Right.
Or like,
Yeah.
cannot be there, cannot be there. So it's like, how can they stand up for themselves in the real world? So it's almost like the clinicals, it's almost like baptism by fire. Like, how do you adapt to these kind of situations before you actually go into these settings for real forever? Or in the sense of forever is like, hey, it's for the rest of your career. You know, you have to deal with this situation without external support from your faculty. You have to find either build allies with your coworkers or some other way around to survive the workplace environment without the comfort of your faculty.
Those are really great ideas. Some of the other folks who are going to be speaking and presenting, recorded like this or live virtual or in person at the conference, they are involved in K-12 education and higher ed. And I'm going to make sure they hear your words, because that idea that we have to do a better job teaching people how to advocate for themselves. What is that skill set? And what does it look like for different presentations, right? I can advocate for myself pretty well in certain situations, but in other situations, those skills just go away. You know, you talked about being in class, you don't want to have a moment where your mind goes blank, right? Because that doesn't look very good. That's something I have to think about when I do these conversations. I have to make sure that I have enough energy left before I do these recorded conversations so that I don't hit a wall and then my mind goes blank and I no longer know what to say. I can't keep track of the conversation, right? So I've had to learn not only how to advocate for myself with the outside world, but to make sure I advocate within my own schedule, right? What are my needs? What do I need to accommodate for myself? How do I need to make sure I'm building my schedule in a way that's going to work for me so that I am at my best? And those are skills that we just do not learn anywhere. Most of us are left to figure them out on our own.
Oh yeah, you are so right on that actually. So that's the reason why, like, for any autistic students who come to me right now, I sort of like, you know what, I hear their day-to-days, what they're dealing with, but then it's like, you know what, I also know like, hey, I have a responsibility to teach them these self-advocacy skills because they may need it in a few weeks or a few months. You never know. But it's like these kind of situations, they may come up. I think it's almost like I have a nice blend because like on one hand, I work in the front lines full time, but then also teach on the side. So I definitely get the higher ed perspective.
Yeah, that's great. You've mentioned a couple of times that you're on social media. I think you found me and the conference on Twitter. So I think you're on Twitter. Where else are you?
So I'm on Instagram, I'm on IG, I'm on LinkedIn. So I can post on the messages. I think after we're done, that'll be easier.
Yeah, I'll make sure that if you send me an email with your contact information so that folks can find you on those social media platforms, I'll make sure that they get set up when your video goes live for the conference.
Oh yeah, I think they will be very surprised. They're like, oh wow, like this like I guess it's like someone is like, yeah, and I think the autistic community they realize like, well, this is no name, but they're like, hey, you know what? This person actually knows a lot.
Well, and it's not about whether or not we have necessarily a name. It's about our lived experience and the fact that you've been willing to sit with me and share your lived experience and share your ideas. I'm just really, really grateful. This was an inspiring conversation full of really good information, and I hope at some point we can do something like this again.
Oh yeah, I definitely think so. Who knows? Yeah, maybe something comes to mind for another year. We can do something like that again.
That sounds great. Well, Dr. Wong, thank you for your time. I think this little bit of conversation is going to do a lot of good for a lot of folks. You have proven through your life that if you can find the skills and the tools and the advocates and the mentors, you can make the life that you want. And you're doing such a good job, and I'm thrilled to have been able to help get your work more noticed in a greater sense of community.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Well, we will hopefully talk again soon. Thanks for your
All
time.
right. Thank
Bye
you.
bye.